Hello, welcome, please come in. Our White Mage only runs are now completed, and it's time to get into the details. I was really curious how White Mages would fare. White Mages are perhaps the single most essential class in Final Fantasy's long history. No other class has been so important to supporting and keeping your party alive pretty consistently. If a Final Fantasy game has a White Mage, you want them in your party at all times. But White Mages only have always been limited in their offensive capabilities. So, when White Mages have to stand on their own, well, it sure does go away. But before I hop into the actual comparison, I first need to answer a question that I've been hinting at for weeks. Where's FF5? And the answer is that I actually did start a recording of an FF5 White Mages only run. My expectation going into the run was that it would be very similar to FF1. Slow but steady for most of the game until I unlocked Holy right at the end. White magic serves basically the same purpose in FF5 as in FF1, so while I no longer had the offensive capability of Arrow, I figured pure survivability could get me through. And that was basically true, initially. White mages are really limited in weapons, being one of the few classes that can't equip daggers, so I had to rely on the mostly inferior staves. And all the early staves deal damage based on strength, which is not really White Mage's strong suit. And unlike Blue Mage or Black Mage, I didn't really have any useful statuses, being limited to Silence and Confuse, which are not the most useful against most bosses. Although I did discover that Living Flame is weak to Confused, and in the humanoid form will just hit itself for physical damage. But none of these are why Final Fantasy V was excluded, not even Ifrit was too bad, though I did have to do a bit of grinding. No, our problem child was unassuming Byblos. The boss absolutely walled this run, completely and utterly stopping it in its tracks. For those less familiar, this may be surprising, but let me run through it for you. First, Byblos counters physical attacks by casting Protect on themselves, reducing my already pitiful damage down to this. They also have an all-target wind attack that deals pretty beefy damage, and a decent physical evasion that drops my flail's already bad accuracy down to about 50%. And no, despite being more accurate, staves are not actually better at dealing damage. Byblos is immune to both Confuse and Silence, my only two statuses, and also has Magic Hammer to reduce my own MP, and Discord to have my level. And because level is used in damage and healing calculations, every time my level is halved, it drastically reduces my offensive capabilities. At this point, I review my options on how to make this fight not suck, and the fun part is, there weren't any. White mages only have two weapons you can get access to at this point, and while the flail is better, both are awful. There are no accessories I can equip that would help enough to make a difference, even if I could access them, which I really can't. The next weapon isn't until nearly the end of the game, and that realization is really what stopped the run. Even if I beat Byblos, my damage would not be improving at any point until nearly the end of the game. Every single boss from this point forward is awful. But Zeph, you just said level is included in the damage calculation. Just level up. Well, I did. Behold, my characters with over 7,000 HP. And no, I did not level up legitimately. I downloaded a cheat engine table to multiply experience gains by thousands of times to see how much grinding I need to do to make this fight not suck. And the answer is all of it. At level 99, with the equipment available to me, White Mages can just barely break triple digits before he casts Protect on himself. So no, I will not be beating FF5 with only White Mages. It can be done. While desperately searching for any advice, I did find a thread, linked in the description, of someone beating the game with only one White Mage. And the Byblos fight took them 5.5 hours by itself. No. I have a finite lifespan on this earth. And while that is considerably longer than any of you watching, I don't want to do this, and I'm not going to. Well, now that that's out of the way, it's time to hop into the actual comparisons. And I start with difficulty and FF1. How difficult is Final Fantasy I compared to the other challenges in this series? The most difficult. I was really unsure where I was going to rank these games in difficulty order. In fact, I'm still a little unsure on my feelings now, but I think FF1 does deserve to be first. Of the runs I actually completed, they were all very samey, I guess, filled with early game struggles to do anything productive until the late game. Then things went really well as can be expected. And that's actually kind of why FF1 gets put into the most difficult, because it really had the weakest endgame build. Like, yeah, tonics are great, but 1, everyone gets tonics, and 2, not having access to haste is real rough. And while the Masamune is great, there are only 2 bosses after that, and White Mage's strength stat leaves a lot to be desired. So while I was able to outlast the bosses, my own damage was very poor. Like the later 2 entries, this game does unlock some ability to deal damage. Gauntlets, Mage Staff, Giant's Gloves, but most of these come over halfway through the game, which makes getting through early encounters a lot more difficult than in a normal playthrough. And to be even more frank, I only beat Chaos on the first attempt because he only used Cure in the boss fight once, before I'd even started attacking. I also had to take a bit of an unconventional route through the game to get upgraded to White Wizards and get access to the tonics and spellcasting items early. That being said, while I think FF1 is the most difficult of the 3 runs, I don't think I'd actually call it that hard. Tedious is probably more the right word. I mean, I was rarely in danger of actually dying, just falling asleep due to boredom. Other runs sometimes suffer due to lack of healing, and that was obviously not the problem here. FF3 is next, and I'll be placing this right at the bottom. While White Mages in FF3 suffer many of the same issues they did in FF1, I also got access to elemental staves and actual offensive magic earlier in the game. I love that they gave White Mages a couple offensive spells. Arrow and Aroga aren't exceptional, but it is nice to be able to more consistently deal a decent chunk of damage, especially in a game that can end up as tedious in any playthrough. I think White Mages actually did better throughout most of this run than Red Mages did. Mostly because Red Mages stopped getting better swords and must rely on magical staves to deal damage, which White Mages can also equip, but have about the same intelligence, but way better healing capacity. Oh yeah, White Mages can equip elemental staves in this game. They can get the bonus damage from rods, Sag, but the elemental staves give a reliable and consistent way to deal damage without expending spell slots. And that alone was enough to get me through some fights that I was a bit concerned about. White Mages in this game are probably the most well-rounded White Mages have ever been in the series, getting the staple healing and buffs you'd expect of White Magic, but also getting just a hint of offensive spells to use when healing isn't needed. I don't need White Mages to outdamage Black Mages, but the inclusion of just a little bit of damage does a lot to make them more interesting. And then the endgame. Then the switch over to Devout to get access to the final spell levels and a much better spread of spell slots. And then the game was boring. I really like FF3, I do, but the endgame is just so tedious. I think if these bosses had their HP pools cut in half or thirds, I might actually really appreciate this endgame section. Sadly, I do not. And the sheer healing and holy power that Devouts have access to at the end of the game meant I wasn't really challenged, I was just bored. Even the bits of grinding I did in the World of Darkness wasn't to make the game easier, it was to make it take less time. Which is a real bummer. And it's time for FF12. FF12 gets to slide right into the middle position, which is about what I expected. White Mages in this game are actually more restrictive than ever. They get basically no offense, no defense, it's really just healing and buffs. And while White Mages can get access to some better weapons, they are, as always, locked behind very late game, or even post game, Espers. I really wish they had put more useful unlockables behind Espers you could feasibly fight earlier in the game. A lot of times these locked licenses just feel pointless. Thank goodness I unlocked Daggers 5 right at the end game. Pay no attention to the fact that in a normal playthrough I would already have higher level daggers, and a second license board with normal weapon access. Just means in a challenge like this, where access to weapons actually is limited, these locked license boards don't really do much for me. Except in this case, where Daggers 5 actually was very useful. I mean, not as useful as it would have been if I'd unlocked it a bit earlier, but hey. And the biggest reason FF12 managed to not get stuck in last is this game's inclusion of motes. These very much serve as the consumable spellcasting items of prior games, but they stretch all the way from early game to end game spells, meaning they stayed useful much longer than normal. And because of this game's interesting treasure chest system, I could actually grind out usable motes way more easily than consumables in prior games. Motes weren't super game-breaking, but having access to Bio, Eroga, and Shock were absolutely essential for making this run easier in many key places, particularly the early game. And while every class can access Berserk and Haste in the same ways I did in this run, far fewer classes can access Bravery for more damage and the sheer defensive suite of spells white mages have access to. Battles were not often fast in this run, but they were often guaranteed wins. And now it's time for the coveted recommended slot. And in some prior series I've done, I've absolutely reached a recommendation section and had to clarify that while I will be putting the games in order of my recommendation, I would actually recommend them all. I think this is the first series that it is the exact opposite. I would not recommend any of these runs to anyone, but I am slave to the format, so let's put them in order anyway. And we'll start with FF1, which gets to be placed in the middle. FF1 has a lot going for it to keep it out of last place. First is that the main offensive options you'll have in the run start to become available around the halfway mark, or a bit earlier if you rush them like I did. Having some all-target magic and powerful tonics does a lot to make the second half of the game go much smoother and less tedious. And while the final boss against Chaos takes way longer than I'd want it to, at least there is strategy you can employ to make the fight more consistent, rather than just having to rush down Chaos as fast as possible. And another boon is that Final Fantasy I is pretty short. And is it insulting that a benefit of doing a run is that it is the shortest game on the list? Yes, but in this case it's not just you don't want to have to do this as much. It's actually because of how slow white mages get through games. White mages have very limited damage, but FF1 is short enough that the challenge takes a game that is fairly short and makes it a reasonable length. White mage only runs are always going to be longer than most other runs, so anything that can be done to keep a run a reasonable length of time, I'm going to count as a plus. And next up is FF3, which I will slide right into last place. It wouldn't be an FF3 challenge run if it wasn't at the bottom of my recommended list. And honestly, that's a real bummer to me, because the run was going so well. My damage was better, fights were more interesting, strategies were being employed. And then, as ever, the endgame. The just miserable slog through samey bosses right at the end of the game. Don't get me wrong, this was way less awful than Red Mages Only, the only other FF3 run I've done on the channel, but it still wasn't great. I definitely had a point where I was wondering if I was going to switch to Devout. Maybe I should stay as White Mage to finish off the run. The thought was absolutely gone by the time the credits rolled. I just don't know what they were thinking here. And I'm aware it's different in the original NES release. For starters, the bosses have way less HP in that version, but in the Pixel Remaster, this is just a slog. I just can't imagine playtesting a fight and thinking, yeah, it's fine that this fight takes 15 minutes of the player taking the same action over and over again. Because to be clear, the final section wasn't difficult. Even the two-headed dragon being able to kill any party member in one hit wasn't interesting. It just meant I had to keep slowly reviving my party in a very tedious loop. And every other boss basically casting the same 3 spells. I can't imagine playing through this game prior to the Pixel Remaster where you don't have quick saves. I think I would have just never played a Final Fantasy again. And whose idea was it to only give the final boss 1 attack? Like, what is this? I've played a lot of Final Fantasy in my life, and this boss having 1 attack is frankly baffling to me. Okay, well that turned very quickly from issues with the White Mage Only run to issues with the game as a whole, so it's about time to wrap up this section. Suffice to say, in a list of runs I wouldn't recommend, FF3 is the one I would recommend the least. And then there was one, and it's FF12, and it goes in first, for all the reasons you might expect. But let's talk about them anyway. First, White Mages have basically the same problems here as they do in every Final Fantasy. Low damage, low durability, and FF12 has a better suite of options to deal with these limitations. Damage slowly expands throughout the game as this game actually has interesting accessories. Between Berserker Bracers and Hermes Sandals, mixed with some Bacchus Cider, it does a lot to boost at least one character's damage, and Bravery is just a cherry on top. And while I often complain about locked licenses being available too late in the game to be useful, Daggers 5 is actually a really nice license for white mages that have been stuck using very weak rods, and the Treaty Blade, for the entire game. Bosch's damage at the end was actually okay, which was a nice treat. And of course, motes. They can be a bit tedious to gather enough to be useful, but the game does have a 4x speed mode, which does a lot to make a very tedious run considerably less tedious. All this combined to make a run that actually continued to evolve as new options became available. And then on the defensive side, the addition of the Bubble Belt and Lure spell, meaning I could actually have one particularly durable white mage doing their best impression of an actual tank, was a pretty big deal. All this combined into a run that actually ended the game at a lower level than normal. I mean, the run still took longer than prior runs, but I was actually a lower level. And one of the big determiners in how difficult and obnoxious a run in FF12 is how much healing you can do against enemies that deal a lot of damage. And having that be just not a problem for the entire run was kinda nice. And that is it. White mage only runs completed, at least as many as I cared to do. And yeah, they mostly proceeded as expected, except the train wreck that was FF5. I was really not expecting that to go as badly as it did. But that's okay, I still got to turn it into content somehow, even if it is only a watch time boost on this video. I did want to shout out that I have a Patreon, linked in the description. I spend a lot of time making these videos, so if you enjoyed the video, want to support the channel, and are financially stable enough to do so, that exists. No pressure though, this channel is free to enjoy for everyone and will remain that way. For now, if you liked this video, be sure to hit that like button. If you'd like to see more of this, feel free to subscribe. Hey! Maybe leave a comment if you have something you'd like to say. But whatever you decide to do, have a safe trip home.